Episode 12 on Pacifism with Todd Lewis.
The Anarcho-Christian Podcast, evaluating the relationship between the Christian and the state.
I'm rising up with a full heart. I'm taking my strength from inside. I'm rising up with a new mind. I'm taking your words and let you all behind. I'm coming up from underneath the wreck, from underneath the bank.
Hi everyone, welcome back. I am very excited to bring you another interview for the show, and this time it's on pacifism. But before we begin, and if you haven't already, hit the subscribe button on whatever podcast you're using so not to miss any future episodes. And if you are not sure where to find us, visit anarchochristian.com/subscribe. There you'll find links to subscribe to the podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, Android, Google Play, and YouTube. Also, we received a new 5-star rating and review on iTunes since the last recording, and it comes from Timmel Otson 21. Great podcast, looking at liberty from a biblical perspective. Nothing else like it on the web. Only downside is the intro music. So I do appreciate that information, and it's something that I have heard before. And in our closed group on Facebook, I've put it to a vote, and it's kind of come out 50-50 on people who like it or don't like it. So if anyone else has an opinion on the intro music, feel free to let us know on iTunes or on Facebook or YouTube or wherever else you're listening to the show. And please be sure to leave a 5-star rating if it's on iTunes. That's going to help us grow the podcast, and it's going to help us reach more listeners. And since the last show, we've had one new patron on Patreon. Scott has pledged a monthly donation to the show, and I cannot be more thankful, Scott. Thank you very much. And if you're interested in supporting us with a one-time or monthly donation through Patreon, please visit the support tab on anarchochristian.com. That will take you to our Patreon page, where you'll find a few ways that you can support us. So if you like what we're doing, hit the link and check out the options for support. And thank you again, Scott, for your financial support. So without further delay, here is my interview with Todd Lewis on pacifism. All right. Well, I have on the line here Todd Lewis. Todd, thank you for joining me on our second interview for the podcast.
Well, thank you for having me on.
And for anyone in our audience that's not aware, Todd Lewis has 2 degrees in history and philosophy from Malone University, and he hosts the Praise of Folly blog and podcast. And he's participated in debates with people that you might be aware of: Stephen Kinsella, Walter Block, and Bob Murphy. So, Todd, again, I appreciate you being here with us today. And are you ready to get started on talking about on pacifism?
Oh yeah, definitely.
Awesome. Okay, so just as a to put it out there, I said that you participate in debates with Stephen Kinsella and Walter Block and Bob Murphy. And for our audience, those names are probably going to be very familiar. And so we're not going to hold that against you. We're going to talk about something completely different from, the NAP and libertarian philosophy. And I think it's something that a lot of our listeners, even if they do consider themselves NAP compliant libertarians, that they're still going to really appreciate this discussion on pacifism and where we see it in the Bible and where we see it in church history.
Well, yeah, for example, like the LCI guys, they really like Greg Boyd. And Greg Boyd isn't a libertarian either, but he's got overlapping concerns.
Absolutely. So I guess, would you mind kicking us off with kind of defining pacifism, and it's been hard for me to kind of nail down some very specific terms and definitions for the different degrees of pacifism that we might find. And for myself, I've only been able to really confirm one, and that would be absolute pacifism. And that would, and correct me if I'm wrong, that would be zero violence, zero force, even in defense, nothing. Are you familiar with other degrees and, like I said, kind of universally accepted terms and definitions of other degrees of pacifism?
Well, yeah. So, for example, the book escapes my mind right now, but John Howard Yoder wrote a book about 16 different kinds of pacifism, how the word is used. But one word that often is familiar to people, and I think let's talk about it, sort of like progressive liberal pacifism, but they're also, strangely enough, kind of okay with the state redistributing wealth, which is implicitly violent.
Right.
I've even heard them talk about that in some of their podcasts. That's one kind. There's also, like, what you might say the early 20th century kind of trendy liberal pacifism of being anti-war, but not really. As long as, if the Soviet Union was in self-defense, that's okay. But like in the 1920s and 30s and 40s, some of these liberal, trendy pacifists, they were not really anti-war in principle, just against the Western powers, not against the Soviet Union. I think in contemporary terms, a more interesting division is between nonviolent civil disobedience by people like Gandhi and King, which is often called pacifism in a sort of blanket statement, and a kind of more strict religious pacifism. In fact, Gene Sharp is one of the more famous proponents of nonviolent activism. And he makes the good point that nonviolent activism isn't really pacifism, because I think he's right. Pacifism is a sort of moral or religious commitment to zero toleration of violence, as you pointed out. Whereas, and it's not really meant to change anybody's minds per se. It's a lifestyle choice that the believer or the philosopher takes. Whereas for nonviolent civil disobedience, you're trying to change somebody's mind by essentially trying to strong arm in a passive-aggressive way. And in that sense, I mean, okay, fine, you're not killing people, that's better than killing them. But that's not strictly speaking pacifism. I think you're right that pacifism, properly understood, would be a zero tolerance for violence. But again, I would agree with some of the LCI folks, is that pacifism itself is got a lot of unwanted baggage, because it seems to imply that you're totally passive. Mm-hmm. You don't do anything. Mm-hmm. Whereas a Christian would argue that, well, no, you should do good, right? It's not just a passive recipient of evil. It's like, right, in Romans 12, it's like, do good to those who do ill to you, you heap burning coals on their head. Mm-hmm. And so it's not just being a passive recipient of someone's aggression or violence. It's also overcoming that with love. That's what the Christian pacifist position would be. And so in that sense, that's those are some of the ways you could deal with pacifism. But one thing that I do like is, in the 16th century, the Anabaptists used a German word, Wehrlosigkeit, which translates into defenselessness or being weaponless. And so that's a term that's very specific, very descriptive, and it doesn't have a lot of baggage. It's German, so it might be hard to pronounce. But I think that it better encapsulates it. It's that Christian pacifists are people that go around without weapons. Most other cultures view that some sort of weapons in self-defense or in aggression are acceptable. And so I think that's one of the key things, that using violence, even in self-defense, is unacceptable on this position. And that's what I think separates it from a lot of other positions that might be similar superficially, in that they reject initiation of force or aggression or even excessive violence. But that, again, they're only similar in some superficial ways, not they would say in a fundamental way.
Sure. And my personal take on pacifism is that I think the term currently receives, it's very negative. It's sort of derogatory term today. And, if you say that you're not in support of a particular war or a particular action, you're a pacifist in this most derogatory manner, you're called that. And for myself, I see a lot of value in looking at the pacifist position and looking at the reason why people would consider themselves a pacifist, and looking at some of these other groups that are either consider themselves pacifist or are called pacifist. And, my personal perspective on that is that we shouldn't use violence. We shouldn't use coercive force against others. But I do believe that the Bible allows us or commands us to love our neighbor and to be loving to our neighbor. And at some point, I'm sure that loving your neighbor and loving your enemy will come into conflict with each other if your enemy is hurting your neighbor. And it wouldn't be loving to let them sit through the violence from the enemy. So, of course, that gets into a whole long rabbit trail of like what would be acceptable use of force. But and I don't really want to, I guess, get into that debating pacifism at all, because like I said from the start, I do think that pacifism has a lot of merit, and it's something that I think that Christians need to be more aware of, and they need to be more understanding of. And I understand that my position from a pacifist, it probably wouldn't qualify as pacifism because there's some sort of defensive force. But then also, like I said, from the other side, I would be derogatorily referred to as a pacifist. So anyways, moving forward though, you mentioned the Anabaptist, and we talked prior, you mentioned that you were an Anabaptist. So I would like to frame a lot of this around that that's where you're coming from. That's your theological beliefs, and that's where you draw a lot of your conclusions about this. And so if you wouldn't mind, for the audience, give us a brief history on the Anabaptist movement, and I guess lay out exactly what are some of the tenets of Anabaptist.
Yeah, well, the Anabaptist movement, originally, earlier consensus on scholarship, beginning with the Harold Bender, was a kind of monogenesis theory that the Anabaptists developed out of, I think, Zurich, Switzerland. But more contemporary scholarship argues that there's a sort of polygenesis theory where there was a certain kind of idea that was ripe at the time, and it developed throughout the Holy Roman Empire, so Switzerland, Austria, Holland, Germany. But the first Anabaptists did develop in Zurich. So in Zurich, you have Zwingli, who's leading the Reformation. And one of the things that the Reformation does is it questions the traditions of the Catholic Church. Are they to be found in the Scriptures? Now, different reformers come to different conclusions on to what is to be derived from the Scriptures, what is not from the received Catholic tradition. Or they're also divided on whether these things are adiaphora or not. Adiaphora means it's indifferent. They may not be found specifically in the Bible, but they may be, indifferent. It's not a big deal, right? And so the Lutherans and the Anglicans tend to be a little more conservative in that regard. They didn't get rid of as much as, say, Calvinists or Anabaptists did. And so Zwingli, he objects to the real presence in the Eucharist. He objects to the priesthood. He objects to a lot of things that the Catholic Church stood for. But he seeks the approval of the Zurich Council in order to enforce his dictates. And the Anabaptists, who initially used to follow Zwingli, because they were like, yeah, this is great, let's look at the Bible and see what it says and compare it to what the Catholic Church is teaching, they're like, well, wait a minute, we don't see in the Bible where Jesus says that the civil authorities should be used to impose even his laws, his wishes on people. And from just that minor difference got them killed. They would be typically drowned. That would be called the third baptism. And that's because they believed in rebaptism, the idea that baptizing an infant didn't count since they didn't give consent to it. And in one sense, that's a very libertarian thing, right? Because these other churches, it's infant baptism, so there's no consent to be given. And so they place a high value on consent as sort of affirming the legitimacy of an action. So that's why they were so insistent on the fact of adult baptism, because is such an important decision to join the body of Christ that it should be made with the full consent of the individual who's participating in it. And in a lot of ways, you can see some proto-libertarian concepts here of a privileging of consent, whereas the other church traditions at the time did not go there. And another thing they were also considered seditious for is their notion of not resistance. They wouldn't fight in the army. They wouldn't do anything like that. Now, they would pay taxes, and they would honor civil authorities per Romans 13. But you see, in the medieval and Renaissance world, church and state were linked together. They were two sides of the same coin. And really, to not engage in the official religion of the state would be today the equivalent of, basically being an unreconstructed Southerner that advocated for slavery, or for being a libertarian, or for being any sort of beyond the pale position. But it was even more than that. It was considered a kind of treason. But now, of course, we don't have. So that would be more like trying to say we should kill the president. Right? That would be considered treason today in the United States, because the organized churches are not united with the state. So that's sort of how it developed. But some of the key tenets of the Anabaptists are adult baptism, which is based on a prioritizing of consent, non-resistance, as per Matthew 5 and the Sermon on the Mount, not swearing of oaths, the notion of discipleship. So, for example, one of the things you'd see in the laity of both magisterial Reformed churches like the Lutherans and the Anglicans and in the Catholic churches was a kind of laxity towards spiritual faith and moral rectitude. For example, the city of Rome in the 1520s was notorious for its brothels and immorality. And they were like, look, if you're Christian, you got to live like one. There's this famous example, I forget if it was a Catholic or a Lutheran who was being tried, but he was being tried for being an Anabaptist. And his defense was, look, I'm not an Anabaptist. I swear oaths, I beat my wife, and I get drunk. That was his defense against being an Anabaptist. And so they took this discipleship very seriously, and they had a very high personal moral standard for the laity. Right, so for the Catholics, the clergy were held to a very high standard, at least, theoretically. But the laity, not so much. And so the Anabaptists were like, no, we should all be held to this high Christ-like standard. And so it was more of rather than, so the Catholic setup was, the church says this, you should do what the church says, and as long as you do what the church says, you're going to be okay and you're going to make it to heaven. And if you mess up, you got confession and all these other things to help out with. The Anabaptists are like, well, these people still are not, they're not being held to the standard they should be. And they're like, what's the standard is not the teaching of some church hierarchy, but Jesus' own words himself. And so they then said, well, we all have to be held to a high standard, the standard that Jesus himself calls us to be standing for. And then also the two kingdom theory, which is the idea that there are two kingdoms, which I suppose in some sense can be derived from Augustine's The City of God, the city of man, the city of God. But it's a little different in the sense that for them, there was the kingdoms of this world that Satan ruled. So this would be like the temptation of Christ in the desert that we find in Matthew 4:8 and Luke 4:5, where Satan says, I have the kingdoms of this world, and if you bow down and worship me, I'll give them to you. So yeah, they would say, yeah, he really does own the kingdoms of this world, which is, of course, why we can't be a part of these kingdoms. And then there's the kingdom of God, which is supposed to be salt and light to the world. So this separation from the world is partly derived from this two kingdoms theology. So that's sort of a brief overview of the origins and teachings of Anabaptism.
No, thank you very much. And I was unfamiliar with a few of those details. And is it safe to say that Anabaptists would openly use any phrases that we use about anarchism or anarchy or anything like that? Or
I would say that until recently, because there are some Mennonites and Anabaptists that would use that, I think it would be a bit anachronistic to call them anarchists. And I don't think that they would have self-identified as that. Because, again, it also depends on what you mean by anarchist. Because a lot of a lot of anarchism has a negative connotation as well.
Sure. Yeah.
Basically, just digging your heels in, rebelling, rebel without a cause kind of thing, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
Also, there's a lot of militant atheism packed into that, like Bakunin. He said even if God existed, we'd have to kill him.
Right.
As a paraphrase of Voltaire, God does not exist, we'd have to create him. So there's a lot of negative connotations as well that they might not be appreciative of. But for what it's worth, Leo Tolstoy, the Christian anarchist, did view the Anabaptists as predecessors to his own Christian anarchism.
Okay. Well, great. And so you've mentioned a couple of people older than the Anabaptist and the Anabaptist coming out of the Reformation. What can you tell us about the history of pacifism in the church? I guess from year one to the Reformation, how prevalent is pacifism? How is it identified and seen throughout church history?
Yeah, well, I would say for the first 3 centuries prior to Emperor Constantine, that was the universal position of the church. The church fathers throughout the Roman Empire, throughout the 3 centuries, through the different geographic regions from Gaul to Egypt to Greece and North Africa, to Rome itself, all agreed to this. The most contemporary scholarship on the matter, to my mind, which has not yet even been seriously addressed, is we have Ronald J. Siders, The Early Church on Killing, a comprehensive source book on war, abortion, and capital punishment. And we have George Galantzis' Caesar and the Lamb, Early Christian Attitudes on War and Service. Now, one of the things that's interesting is that when you look at this, Ronald Siders says, first, up until the time of Constantine, there's not a single Christian writer known to us who says that it is legitimate for Christians to kill or join the military. In fact, there was a 3rd century document, I think published by Hippolytus of Rome, which is called the Apostolic Tradition, which argues that if a person who's a Christian joins the Roman army, they are to be put out of the church for having rejected God. And so that's more of a pastoral issue, but if you look at the other church fathers and documents at the time, they really are opposed to war in full. A great summary of this is actually Tom Woods himself interviewed George Galantzis. And I recommend that anybody interested in a survey of the consensus of the church listen to that interview with Galantzis by Tom Woods. Galantzis does an excellent job of summarizing this position. Now, one of the things that sort of marks a shift in this is a kind of a twofold, right? You have the effects on the ground. Emperor Constantine is claiming to be a Christian now. And then we have an attempt to justify it. And the attempt to justification was one of eschatology. A sort of amillennial, post-millennialism was in place where they literally believed that the kingdom of God had come. So like in Psalm 2 where it says the Son of God will rule the nations with a rod of iron. They assumed that would be for them right now with Emperor Constantine. Now, eventually that argument was dropped because obviously the Roman Empire collapsed and disappeared. It was not the realized kingdom of God. So they switched to other excuses to run an empire. But the point is this, and to make it brief and simple, that it was a change in eschatology that helped facilitate this. But, let's put it into context. So having survived the worst persecution ever at the time, the Diocletian persecution, it's certainly understandable why they might have thought that. Yeah. One can argue they should have known better, as do I. But going through hell and back, you can at least sort of understand why they thought this. Because this was inconceivable, really, that a Roman emperor who had persecuted the Christians for centuries would say they were a Christian. Mm-hmm. So at this point, pacifism is really not, even sort of anti-statism, is not a really big element in the Christian tradition. There's little bits here and there. I think one of the most interesting pre-reform groups, there's really two. There's the Waldensians. They were known for being pacifist. Though when they converted to the Reformed tradition after the Reformation, they gave that up. And another one is a little-known Czech theologian activist named Peter Hutschitsky. He was popular during the Hussite Wars. So in the Hussite Wars, there were basically two factions fighting it out. There were the Taborites, basically militant proto-Protestants who opposed the Church of Rome, mostly because at the time the Church of Rome believed that the communion should not be given in both kinds to the laity, only the bread. And that was one of the main things that Jan Hus was concerned about before he was killed. Now, the other thing is that the Utraquists were more of accommodationists. They wanted to be more accommodating with the Catholics. And so one of the things that they did was, so they started fighting. Ultimately, the Catholics would back the Utraquists. But there was a group in the middle that followed Peter Hochschild, and he argued that this whole, mutual brotherhood slaughter was just insane. It's civil war, brother against brother,
Right.
And he's like, this is not what the gospel teaches. In fact, again, his name escapes me, but there was a Slavic painter in the early 1920s who did a sort of paintings of great historical moments in the history of the Slavic people. And Hochschild gets a slot. It shows him at the aftermath of a battle tending to the sick and the wounded. And so, in fact, Tolstoy, probably one of the best Christian anarchists in describing the sort of intellectual history of these groups. Again, they're not strictly speaking anarchists, but because it's somewhat anachronistic. But there's certain trends and beliefs and thoughts that they have that one would find an anarchist, comfortable with, and even probably derivative of.
Yeah, I'm really interested in some of the quotes that you mentioned. That it really shows that pacifism was a bigger concept than just me personally can't or won't use force against you. That there was this understanding of relating it to the state and relating it to warfare and relating it to the military and some of those concepts. And I think that's kind of interesting, and it's something that is really glaring with the current state of the church, especially in context of pacifism and should we or shouldn't we react or act like this. So that's really interesting to me that it is such a bigger concept than just the individual is a wimp and he won't do something to help himself.
Well, exactly. There was this one quote where in the Contra Celsus, the dialogue with Celsus, where Origen is arguing with the Roman philosopher Celsus. Celsus accuses him of saying, well, you people don't take up arms, so the barbarians will take over. And Origen is like, well, if you all were like us, there wouldn't be any barbarians at all. And it just shows you the sort of counterintuitive message of Christ in the scriptures, that, responding to evil with good leads to triumph, is the true victory.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. That's great. So, I mean, now we're getting into this idea of where do we find it? You mentioned what Christ said. You mentioned a couple of the points where the Anabaptists have drawn from Scripture. So if you could go over a couple of the main points that supports pacifism and at least supports it in the way that we've discussed it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, okay. I would argue that the place that we should start is in the Old Testament. Now, without getting into the details of the violence of the Old Testament, how you interpret that, we can safely say in the beginning God created a world that was perfect, without violence, and war and murder and violence were not intended in his original creation. And we also see in the Old Testament a sort of prophetic promise of an age of peace, right? We see Isaiah 2, 1 through 4, Micah 4, 1 through 3, and Zechariah 9, 9 to 10. Now what's interesting is all three of those passages deal with the coming of Christ, coming in the incarnation to preach peace to the Gentiles. Now Zechariah 9, 9 is about his triumphal entry to Jerusalem, which we read about in the Synoptic Gospels. Now what's interesting is in each of those cases, Christ coming to teach is associated with Christ teaching us to stop fighting. Mm-hmm. Now, all the early church fathers who spoke on these passages prior to Constantine interpreted it as saying that, yes, we right now as Christians don't kill people. In fact, Irenaeus said that the fact that we don't kill people anymore is proof that this already happened, that the prophecy of Isaiah about Christ coming to save the nations has already occurred. Now, we see, of course, the most famous passage is, of course, Jesus in Matthew 5:38-42, rather. Do not resist an evil person. The overturning of the lex talionis. We also read in Romans 12:20-21, do good to evil people. 1 Corinthians 6:1-8, don't sue. Paul even says, rather you lose your property. In fact, suing somebody, you do wrong. It's what the Apostle Paul says. Hebrews 10:34, don't seek legal action, against people who steal your property. And then Hebrews 12:14, live in peace with all people. So, what are the things that people typically kill for? They kill for their property, they kill for their God, they kill for wounded honor, they kill for the state. So, we're not supposed to kill to defend our property. Well, and of course, Paul says that love is all suffering. It doesn't count a wrong suffered. So we're not supposed to kill for a wronged honor. Christ orders us not to kill in his name, right? When he's being tried by Pilate, in John 18:36, he says, my kingdom is not of this world. If it were, my servants would fight to protect me. Mm-hmm. And so we see here that, so right there, Christ says, okay, so you don't kill for God. We read that we don't kill for property and money. We read that we don't kill for the nations because the nations belong to the devil. Matthew 4:8, Luke 4:5, and then also we have Revelation 11:15. And so the things that people normally kill for are, of course, in the New Testament context, sort of drained of the impetus to kill for those things. Hmm. We can also look at Revelation 17 and 18 as a, whatever your eschatology is, as a criticism of empire, of the sort of what Augustine would call the city of man, this proud, arrogant, destructive force that just amasses power and wealth for itself at the expense of everybody else. Hmm.
And, I think you correctly identified the things that people war over and fight over, property, resources. And I wonder if you wouldn't mind entertaining the idea of when someone says, well, it's not about that, but it's protection, it's defense over those objects. What is your response to that? That we can defend our property, through force, and I guess there are, of course, varying degrees where some people say you can use deadly force, some people say no, you can't use deadly force, but you can use some other sort of way to put someone into to make them stop. What is your personal opinion on some of those critiques of using those verses for this absolute pacifism that you can't use any sort of force for your defense of property?
Yeah, I guess the first thing I'd say is, as Christians, of course, our guide for behavior is Christ. And I would say, that did Christ do these things? He famously said the foxes have holes and the birds have nests, but the Son of Man has nowhere to lay his head. So, on this earth, he did not claim property to fight over. He had a kingdom, which was rightfully his, but he did not kill to maintain it or to achieve it. In fact, his kingdom was brought in by his own sacrificial death. Mm-hmm. Which again, it's sort of the upside down kingdom, as Anabaptists are fond of calling it, right? A king does exactly the opposite. He comes in with an army and conquers all of his opponents and enslaves them or beheads them or something. Whereas Christ does the opposite. He comes in and he's the one that serves and gets killed. Mm-hmm. And the other thing I'd say is that it's the witness of the early church is one that's difficult to ignore, right? Because one would have to say that as soon as the apostles died, the church just got it wrong. So, for example, when in New Testament studies, when Christians are trying to make the case for the historical Jesus, and even non-Christians like, say, Bart Ehrman, they'd say there just isn't enough time in between the events described and what we read in the Gospels and in Paul's letters for any sort of elaborate inventions to have developed. And there needs to be time for this to happen. There also needs to be a source that you can point to have explanatory power. And, there just isn't there. So when John dies in, 1996 AD, the earliest Christian writers are all saying this. Mm-hmm. So there just isn't enough time for this kind of error to creep in. And B, there's really no source to ascribe it to, right? Because you have to have explanatory power, right? So where do they get this from? Well, if it was an error or a deviation, it had to come from somewhere. But to my mind, no one's been able to point out where. And again, not enough time has passed for these kinds of innovations and errors to take place. I mean, if you look at like the Gnostic errors, I suppose they were already present. The apostles themselves were warning against them, like 1st, 2nd, 3rd John and the like. But that's a special case because we have to have the direct apostolic confrontation of it.
Oh, yeah, that's a good point. And one thing that bothers me about the criticism of pacifism from other Christians, is that I kind of imagine this low-key or unrecognized way of bashing martyrs, where even in the farthest right version of evangelical Christianity, we hold martyrs to a very high regard. And, there's the most famous book on it is Fox's Book of Martyrs. And I think over and again, we see pacifist martyrs, pacifists, dying, and not dying in warfare, to bring the kingdom about, but dying for their belief. And what are some thoughts that you have on that? Is that something that you've seen as well? And just that contradiction, it seems to hold martyrs to this very high regard, but then on the other hand, they'll use the term in this derogatory manner, this pacifist term in a derogatory manner.
Or even martyr, right? They'll say, oh, he wants to be a martyr.
Yeah.
They'll use that derogatory term. Well, I mean, it is kind of ironic, right? Because obviously a martyr is someone who failed to defend themselves. And so to, on one hand, hold someone up who for whatever reason was unable to defend himself. But not in another case, does seem to be somewhat hypocritical. But even more fundamentally, Jesus didn't defend himself. He took the blows, as Isaiah says, no anger or lies were found in his mouth. So, he didn't talk back to the Sanhedrin when they were falsely accusing him of all these things that they accused him of. So I would say that there is a contradiction here, but I think it's interesting to point out that it's relatively new, because I remember reading an article on Lou Rockwell a few years ago by Lawrence Vance, and he pointed out that the SBC was actually very anti-war for a very long time. It's really only after Vietnam that the Southern Baptist Convention became gung-ho. And one has to wonder how much of this is not the education problem of the Vietnam syndrome that the United States government tried to overcome, right? People were tired of the war. There's a lot of anti-war activism. And, so for them, Vietnam syndrome was something to be solved. And I think in some sense, this is a legacy of that. And in another sense, too, this is something that, to backtrack a little bit, the United States in the 18th and 19th century was actually a kind of renaissance of peace churches. There were lots of independent religious communities, usually Protestant, sometimes even non-Trinitarian Christian, who did this. One of the most famous, actually, is, believe it or not, Pentecostals. Pentecostals were initially a peace church. One of their leaders said, if we're going to take the Bible literally on speaking in tongues, we better take it literally on turning the cheek as well. What's interesting is after World War II, a lot of these peace churches went away. So it's kind of a 1-2 punch. In World War I, a lot of these peace churches were heavily persecuted. Some of these people were even shot and killed. Not very many, but some were. And so that led to a lot of repression. And then in World War II, it was the good war, fighting Nazis, yada, yada, yada. And so it was really just almost inconceivable, right, that someone would just say no to this. And a lot of those groups, I think, got broken. to some degree. They just thought, okay, we're done putting up a fight. And then furthermore, this Vietnam syndrome reprogramming, to get rid of it. I think those are elements of how this happened, but it is regrettable that it has happened.
Yeah, it is interesting in the 20th century, especially with some of the big wars that we have with the world wars and then Vietnam as well. So, I mean, we have World War II, which is just generally accepted as a good war and something that it was good that we were a part of. And so I think that Americans and Christians can look back on it and they can look at it and say, well, there's the benefits, there's where war is good, and use it as an example for that. And then we have on the other side of it, Vietnam, as you said, where we do see a lot of atrocities. We see a war that we lost, that the United States lost, and I look at the overall societal general opinion of World War II being a great good thing, and then the people that were opposed to Vietnam generally being of the hippie generation and something that is, I guess, considered morally in opposition to Christianity. And these two mindsets, it seems, did in the mid 20th century and leading into the late 20th century have led to this Christian, very strong opinion of the church to be in favor of war.
Yeah, I would say that there's a lot of factors, but I think one thing that Christian libertarians have generally, I think, been pretty good on is that really this love affair with statism and war begins with Constantine. Mm-hmm. And I think only recently have many, and not even all, many modern Christian denominations have come to terms with that and said, okay, well, that might not have been the best move to make, but So, for example, like the post-Vatican II Catholic Church, right? Or some of the more, I guess you could say some of the mainline Protestants, but not just even them. I think most Christians today would agree that, yeah, we shouldn't go around killing each other for different doctrinal differences. Right. And in that sense, that's one of the legacies of the Anabaptists, right? We were one of the first groups that pioneered this idea that, no, you shouldn't be killing people who have a different theological position than you do.
Yeah. Yeah.
Which again is only recapturing the original position, which was unfortunately lost under this Constantinian synthesis.
Yeah, with Constantine, I've always, I think you kind of touched on it a little earlier, where in one hand you can look at it and you can say this is the start of the church mixed with the state. And it's and it's all downhill from there, spiritually for the church. But then on the other hand, you can also give them a little bit of leeway where, they were the most persecuted, group in the known world at the time. And then to come out of that, to have, to just not just be not persecuted, but to also have a sense of protection and a sense of being able to be relevant and legitimate, recognized by the authorities. And so it always has been kind of a mixed thing with me and Constantine where, was he intentionally doing it? Was he doing it to, for, bad, reasons? And were the Christians around him, were they true Christians? Were they just thankful to be done with it? Were they looking for something? They were a little bit misguided, but just looking for a way to help Christians, kind of come out of that era of persecution. And it is such a nuanced conversation, in my opinion.
Yeah. Well, yeah, and what's interesting, to give the devil his due, Constantine himself did actually advocate for toleration of all the religions in the empire. His co-emperor in the East, Licinius, he issued a letter to him saying, don't be persecuting pagans just because we've brought Christians into the fold. The sort of empire-wide reversal of the persecution sort of begins with Theodosius, where he starts persecuting the pagans in a way analogous to the way the pagans were persecuting the Christians about a century earlier. But yeah, I think most Christians today, though, would look back at the excesses of the Middle Ages and the Reformation Wars and say, yeah, that was a mistake. We're glad we moved beyond that. And to some extent, I think no small part was played by the Anabaptists, who sort of pioneered this, right? A lot of times you'll see people on the left say, be the change you want to see, or, lead a revolution by example, where you live the way you want to see other people live, and that's an inspiration. I think in that sense, the Anabaptists did do that. They did show a way of, tolerance, where you don't, just go off and kill somebody for disagreeing with you. And also, again, looking at the importance of consent. How important is consent? Well, it's so important that if you're going to, join Christ, then you should consent to it.
Wow. Well, thank you for that overview on pacifism and the Anabaptist tradition, and just I really hope to have you on again sometime. I'd like to talk about more of the Reformed wars and what was happening there with the church, and maybe even Constantine as well, if you wouldn't mind being back on one day.
Oh, no, I'd love to be back on. Thanks for having me on in the first place.
All right. Well, I appreciate it. And I guess as we wrap up, if you wouldn't mind, let the audience know where they can find you online, where they can find any resources.
Yeah, sure. So they can find me at praiseoffolly.blogspot.com. They can find me at my YouTube channel, Praise of Folly, and they can also find me on SoundCloud. Hopefully these will be listed in the show notes, but that's where you can find my work there.
Absolutely. I'll have all the links there for them to find, as well as some of the books and resources that you mentioned during the discussion. So,
oh, yeah, definitely.
I appreciate it. Thank you, Todd.
Well, thank you.
So that's it. What are your thoughts on pacifism, its history in the church, and how it's portrayed today? Let me know what you think, or like and share the episode on Facebook, Twitter, YouTube, or iTunes. Please consider leaving a 5-star rating and review on iTunes and becoming a supporting listener through Patreon. If you're interested in grabbing a copy of the books that we mentioned, I will have an Amazon link in the show notes. If you use the link, Anarcho-Christian will receive a small commission with no additional charge to you. So, until next time, grace and peace. No king but Christ.
Thank you for listening to the Anarcho-Christian Podcast. Subscribe to our email notifications at anarchochristian.com, like us on facebook.com/anarchochristian, and follow us on Twitter at anarchoxp. Subscribe to our podcast and YouTube to join us next time as we continue to evaluate the relationship between the Christian and the state. No king but Christ.
This has been a Pax Libertas Productions podcast.